formally introduce today's speaker is Lakshmi Naaraayanan. So he has done his PhD from HKUST and he is currently an assistant professor of finance at London Business School. He is going to present a paper titled Winds of Change, Gender Quota on Boards in the Face of Patriarchy. His work in the similar area has already been published in the Journal of Financial Economics, and hopefully this work will also get published in GFE or some other similar journal. Over to Lakshmi. The floor is yours. I think as a rule, we do not interrupt the speaker for the first 5 minutes unless there is a clarificatory question. And thereafter, if you allow Lakshmi, we can ask questions as we go along.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than happy, even first 5 minutes. More than happy. I think as interactive as it is, the better it's for everyone. But I'm more than happy for people to chime in and ask questions whenever they think, there's something that's clarificatory or any other nature. Let me try to share my screen and try to see if I am able to see this. Oops. Okay. So can you see this stuff moving? And is it the full screen one?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. So thank you, Varun and Srini, for inviting me. It's I'm really happy, to be coming back, quote unquote. I love to come in person at some point in time, to meet old friends and old faculty members with whom I've taken courses and so on. So it's definitely very positive, and I'm really looking forward to your comments and thoughts on the paper. So this paper, and I was telling I think Varun and Chavi at the beginning, part of this research agenda on corporate governance in fact started when I was at IIM Bangalore as an FPM student. I remember, I think it was Tapsi Narang's dissertation on CEO compensation in BSE firms that got me interested. I think that was the first dissertation defense that I heard. So I thought, seems like it's an interesting area. I should probably think about it. And I've since then, worked a little bit on this area. So the paper is going to talk about and think about the gender quota that India implemented and trying to learn from it and I'll kind of walk you through some of the things that, we think we learned from this paper that might be informative to other market participants who are considering implementing such changes. And this is joint work with Casper, who's been relatively a long time co-author of mine. So in terms of the motivation, I guess, all of us would agree that, underrepresentation of women in almost every dimension remains, if not the most debated or hotly debated topic, but one of the most important subjects of, at least this century or this decade to begin with. And much of this debate has kind of, especially with a focus on corporate boards, has intensified or kind of has, resurfaced, thinking about the introduction of gender quotas, especially around the 40% gender quota in Norway. There have been, multiple studies, even as of today, trying to understand both the short-term and long-term impact of introducing gender quota in Norway. Subsequently, other countries and mostly European and advanced economies felt that, maybe this is the way to go, where, they wanted to impose a gender quota. And, it kind of followed in Germany, France, Italy, United States, with California and many other states in the US implementing it very recently. However, there's also a recent trend, in emerging markets where, emerging markets also kind of wanted to follow up on some of these, aspects of introducing gender quotas. And, India was kind of at the forefront of this by introducing reservation in the political context back in the 1990s. And, in corporate boards, it was kind of only around in 2013 that they kind of, decided to introduce this. At the same time, Kenya, Pakistan, and many other African countries are now debating introducing gender quotas, right? And I'm going to kind of lay it out that, why we think it's important to understand gender quotas in the context of emerging markets, which are often characterized, for a lack of, better characterization, would be, lax corporate governance standards. And at the same time, they also share this idea that there are very strong patriarchal norms that exist, and I'm going to show you in a few ways in which I'll validate some of these claims that I'm making. and both put together can often lead to suboptimal board composition and quality of directors that sit on the boards, and potentially that can have implications for not just firm value, but also optimal risk taking from the perspective of the firm and the boards, right? And we're going to kind of shed light on these questions in the context of India and try to study and shed light on what are these effects, can we learn something both in the short run, in the long run, and how these things have kind of evolved to begin with. So the question that we are kind of interested in answering in this paper is a very simple one, which is...
Can I interrupt and ask a basic question?
Yes, Srini, please.
Yeah, I was trying to relate this back to a standard principal agent model. This is maybe going, I'm not familiar with the literature, so pardon my ignorance. But if we had to put it in a Holmstrom world, where you have an agent trying to, whose effort is unobservable, you're trying to choose a compensation. It's outside of this paper, I'm just trying to set it up, right? So you're trying to choose a compensation function to maximize the principal's payoff, right? And the agent's effort is unobservable. So when you introduce gender in this context, the modeling kind of modeling thing that happens possibly is that you have two agents who have differences in terms of effort levels, possibly differences in preferences, and differences in, differences in utility, the utility function, and possibly differences in risk, right? So before we get into all of this, I just want to see, what is the basic effect of introducing a woman director to the agency problem. That's why I want to understand that before we, even get to discussing quotas, etc. Right? Is there some work on this? How do people frame it in a theoretical way? Is what I'm asking.
So, broader question outside the ambit of this paper, of course. The broader question about once you, it may not just be a gender lens, right? I mean, you can introduce any distinction between any heterogeneous set of agents. You can introduce in a model and then characterize that based on gender, race, ethnicity, etc. And then you can argue that there are going to be differences. So people have modeled this in many contexts in trying to understand what is going to happen to the riskiness of their decision making, what has happened, what will potentially happen in terms of firm value. So they modeled it in different contexts. So many papers, including Renee Adams has kind of a lot of work on this, especially thinking about introducing, especially along the gender lens, of what should happen to the risk taking. In fact, she also has a paper, if you have what would have happened had it not been Lehman Brothers. So she has a paper titled Lehman Sisters, in trying to think about could the financial crisis have been avoided had you have had female in positions, potentially that would have reduced risk taking. There are many papers that think about this in the context of asset management, where they're thinking about men and women have different risk profiles, and those differences in risk preferences could also mean the investment decisions that they make could be different. So in that framework, it's going to be, as you rightly said, differences that could be differences from risk preferences, but nobody has kind of micro-founded them, because it's hard to say whether those differences emanate from nature versus nurture, right? It's going to be very hard to figure out what the differences are, but conditional on those differences existing, people have documented, and both in modeling and in empirical work, that these differences do lead you to observe outcomes that are going to be different. Now, of course, assigning a causality to that is going to be the biggest challenge, in saying it is because these risk preferences are different. And we will not say anything about that in this paper also. But you're right that people have modeled this, and people have tried to study, and their fundamental claim in validating some of the empirical findings is precisely that there are potentially risk differences or risk preferences that might vary. But I don't think any of those papers can anything say outside of the modeling framework. I don't think they can say anything about causality. Neither will we be saying anything about causality in terms of risk taking, etc., or any differences. But I'll show you quality differences. I'll show you, what happened around, these quotas for, what kind of females were on the board and so on and so forth. That I will be able to show you, but I'll not be able to tell you that, well, these differences in quality is leading to differences in firm decisions.
Okay. No, I just wanted to, in my head,
right,
understand the nature of the problem before I got into the data or the empirics. And the
Right.
way I'm thinking about it, in the Holmstrom world, you're maximizing some payoff, choosing a SFX, which is a compensation function, subject to two constraints. One is the minimum utility constraint, that the agent should get some compensation,
Right.
and incentive compatibility constraint.
Right.
So when you introduce two agents, the constraints become larger. So I'm not saying you should answer this question. I just wanted to know if you have thought about it. These constraints, how do they change the nature of the compensation function? It's outside the scope of your paper. And in terms of performance, the solution may lead to a payoff which is lower than when you have just one type of agent. That's what I was trying to get at.
Right. So no, absolutely no, fair thing. So what I would be able to show you, especially in the context of the compensation, okay. So if you want to think about the compensation structure in a Holmstrom-Tirol model, the compensation structure ideally should reflect some of these. Ideally, it should just reflect your ability and your performance on the board, so that you are being paid for performance on the board. But what tends to happen is, because there are other laws surrounding pay, etc., where you can't discriminate on the basis of the pay, you don't see much variation, at least in the context of US. But what I'll show you in the context of India is that there is a significant variation in the pay, even though there is a restriction. And what I'll be able to say something about is the fact that, as an outcome of gender quotas expanding the labor pool, you do see it being reflected that now there is more supply of labor, of female directors in the economy, and these are well qualified. And what I will show you is that for the same female director who was sitting on the board before, the actual compensation gap relative to another male with the same set of positions is going to go down. And that's kind of telling you the fact that, women earlier potentially were not being rewarded for some of the ability. And now, as you're forcing them, some of these market inefficiencies in the compensation structures are kind of going down. Putting this in a framework would then kind of suggest that, kind of an ex post analysis will then tell you that, compensation structures ex ante were not competitive, and they were working in the same framework as you have in mind, which is that, they were paying two different compensation structures, at least towards the lens of, being a male and a female. So in that sense, it is there. But in the US, you won't find this, because compensation contracts, cannot vary within the same firm. And that's by law. The only thing that can vary is you can allow directors to sit on multiple meetings in the same year, and that's the only thing that's going to generate the variation. But what I'll show you in India is, even outside of that, even the compensation that's paid per meeting basis is going to go down. Is going to go up, and it's not going to come from the fact that males are losing out, but that because there's a shift in the quality of the available females, you actually see it increasing for women, other than changes in the quality, other than changes in the distribution itself. Yes, Shashi.
Lakshmi, hi. You made reference to heterogeneity, and I have a related question. And like Srini's, it's also coming in part from complete ignorance of corporate governance. So let me ask a similar question. What's the right way to think about how should a firm choose a board? So what's the objective function? What's the choice problem here? How should a board be selected? Number one. Number two, if gender is just one dimension of heterogeneity, then do your results or does your work speak to the importance of, homogeneity versus non-homogeneity? Is gender just a proxy for it? And then number three and four, it's about prior empirical work. What does the literature say about what's the value to a skeptic who might think, an extreme skeptic, it really doesn't matter what your board is? What's the value of a well-functioning board? And the last one, so you mentioned some stuff about risk-taking and so on. So do I take from it that there's a well-established association between gender and differences in risk-taking?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. Let me try to start the conversation about what is an optimal board. So there is a, there's a famous JFE paper by Lalita Naveen and Naveen Daniels and Jeff Coles in the JFE in 2008, where precisely they try to model this. And their idea is that if firms are optimally maximizing their boards, then you should potentially see that larger firms should have larger boards. But then they show that when a board becomes very large, then you also have these opposing costs that come about, which is to say that as you are a larger firm, you have more monitoring needs at the same time. You also, with the size of the board, you're also increasing agency costs in the firm, because then you are inducing, as Srini and Shashi are pointing out, you're also inducing many directors potentially, who may shirk given the optimal composition of the board, and that would mean there's going to be an inverted U relation relative to the size of the board. So they basically argue that you should not find a linear relationship between firm size and board size. If anything, you should find an inverted U, because at some point this trade-off between the benefit of having enough a large board size to monitor CEO's action would be kind of countervailed by the force of some people optimally choosing to shirk rather than increase effort to monitor the board. So that's kind of the framework. Now, their papers then thought about saying, well, now in this framework, if you start injecting constraints, now, the one constraint that, people started thinking about was gender quotas, right? So it's not very clear what would happen, right, in this framework. So if it is the case that, females are better monitors, right? They're better monitors than men, then optimally replacing males for females, holding constant the quality, potentially you should see that the firm value should go up, right? Because you're now getting better dedicated monitors who can potentially curb CEO excess pay and so on and so forth, and also take actions to do this. And this might be more valuable in a context like emerging markets, where, suboptimally, even the male director pool is very old. They don't have, they lack quality, etc. Right? So that could be one way in which this could happen. The other way would be that now you're forcing firms that are already at the optimal, right, without any constraints. They had, in the world where there's no constraint, firms are optimally choosing their board structure, and they have, whatever fraction we observed before the gender quotas was the optimal level. Whether it's an all-male board or an all-female board doesn't really matter. Firms are optimally choosing based on all the constraints that they're facing. And to that framework, if you think that, if you add gender quota as a constraint, this will, if anything, reduce firm value, because now you're forcing firms to do something that is suboptimal from the perspective of an ex-ante sense, where they were choosing freely without any constraints, right? So all the male directors the firm thought is going to add value, female, by forcing the firm to replace one male by female, or by expanding the board size, you're actually reducing the value. So that could be the other view in this framework, when you want to put a lens of saying, well, firms are unconstrained, they're optimally deciding, and adding this constraint to, especially when it's government mandated and you are forced to do it, it might potentially reduce firm value. The third thing would be that, hey, it really doesn't matter. You expand your board size, it would not have any effect in terms of overall value, because it really did not matter, and the marginal female on the board is not going to materially change any decision making, or is not going to materially change any conversations that you're having. And if that's the view that you have in this framework, then that would mean that there is no impact on kind of firm value. So that's kind of the framework that people have kind of used in the context of imposing gender quota or other constraints, to think about how that can potentially translate to the optimal both sides and also firm value to begin with. The second question that you had is the fact that what is the evidence on gender and risk taking and so on. So much of this literature, not just the quotas literature, but the gender literature, has mixed evidence on whether there is greater risk taking appetite, lower risk taking appetite, and how that kind of relates to investments or decision making to begin with. So the experimental evidence is different from the empirical evidence, and that kind of is very different across the different broad section of countries to begin with. So experimental evidence, people have found different results depending on whether you've run it in Germany, depending on whether you've run it in Finland. People have found the effect of gender quotas to be very different, and much of that literature has been kind of focusing on advanced economies, where they argue that well, in these economies the problem is that the supply of high quality female directors is limited. So our view that if you're now going to force all firms to have a certain fraction of their boards dedicated to a gender lens, it's going to potentially reflect in the fact that, one, these females, high quality females are going to sit on multiple boards and they're going to get a lot more busier, which means that their monitoring function is going to go down. And that's potentially harmful for firms in these economies. And they kind of find evidence with that using stock price reaction and in the long run to begin with. At the same time, there are studies that have found, especially in the context of Norway, you have studies that show there's a negative stock price reaction, and they interpret this as evidence in favor of lacking high quality female directors. They've also found there's a recent management science paper by Espen Egbo and Karen Thorburn where they show that there is no stock price, there is no evidence of any changes in stock price reaction, suggesting that potentially this is not a concern to begin with. There is even though there is a lot of high quality female directors, it doesn't apply the firm, it doesn't affect the firm value significantly. However, it does change the nature of the decision making within the boards, right? So you have within the same country evidence from different set of papers, all established authors, kind of trying to tell you that it's not, the jury's still out on what's this relationship going to look like. I guess the third and the fourth question were on similar lines, or?
Yes, both similar. I think it's. I mean, I have enough. I personally have enough of a perspective, so I think.
Okay. Yeah. So I hope, Srini, I kind of added a little bit more color to some of the questions you had early on.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Please.
Right. So as I said, in theory, and if you write down some of these models, that's the view that you would have, that maybe things were suboptimal in the economy beforehand, and now you're replacing males with females who are more dedicated. It's going to be a lot more valuable in a context like emerging markets, where already the standards for hiring male directors is poor, given that they're very old, especially they're less likely to be independent, they're connected to the family, etc. And now kind of forcing these firms to make a change and have more females participate in the economy could be an important way of having more quality, improving the quality of the boards, and more broadly at an aggregate level, improving corporate governance standards to begin with. At the same time, there is this argument to kind of mention that this could also come about in the context of India, that there could be limited supply of quality female directors, and this could kind of happen not just by virtue of not having enough females who are directors, but also because there are gender disparities in labor market participation. Much of it is kind of driven fundamentally by patriarchal views, which kind of suggests that potentially a limited role for such, gender quotas to work in such environments. And this goes back to our discussion on the framework, where, now you would think that, now in these settings, if the quality is limited and not enough good quality females are participating, then, potentially, male incumbent directors who have a strong voice in deciding who sits on the company may then decide to appoint females who are related to insiders, which would then limit both the size and the quality of the labor pool and potentially be detrimental to firm value, right? And this is a narrative that essentially was put forward, if you had read back in the day, Business Standard, The Hindu, and Times of India, etc. That is one of the strong push, saying, hey, what this is fundamentally going to do is this is going to allow female family members to now formally participate as independent directors or as regular directors on boards, and this was kind of formalizing some of the agency issues, and it was kind of done systematically, and it could be a big problem, right? So you can see that it can spin both ways, and ultimately I don't think we'll be able to completely answer it, but at least we can shed some light on different aspects of it, and kind of show you which of these things did play out eventually in the short run and in the long run. Padmini, you have a question?
Yeah. The law had changed recently to say that, you have to have independent women directors. Probably you have included that as well.
Yeah. So what we do, the law that Padmini is referring to, that there was a Birla committee that was Quota committee. Yeah, the Quota committee was the one that was appointed in 2017, and they came out with this recommendation, which ultimately SEBI approved, is to say, well, not only you should have one female director, which was the initial law, it said you should also have the one female director should be independent as well. And then they implemented that starting in April 2019 for the first top 500 market cap firm, and then they expanded it to top 1,000. And we do have some robustness to show that firms were not stocking up female directors in response to or in anticipation to some of these issues. So what we're going to show in the paper is we're going to take this question in three, we're going to answer this question that, do gender quotas work in such environments where you have very strong patriarchal norms or views in three parts. So first, we're going to look at, at the time when firms were allowed 1 year to comply with this gender quota, how did they choose to respond? Which firms responded, and what happened? The second thing then we are going to look at is, after that year when they were allowed to, choose which females to appoint to comply with the law, we are then going to try to understand, what happens to other firms in the economy based on, whether they had, male incumbent directors who had strong views, whether they went out of their way to appoint more females than that was required by the law, and how did those firms choose to comply with the law, in terms of appointing the nature and the quality of the female directors who were voluntarily appointed. And last, we're going to then try to understand that, and I'll show you that, there was a significant increase in the number of unique female directors that were now participating as directors on boards. How did that change the labor market opportunities for these female directors? And here our focus is going to be that, is it just tokenism that, they're just hiring women, or are they really putting them on important committees that really matter? What happens to the quality of the female directors who are appointed? And lastly, I'll be able to show you some result on what happens to the gender gap in compensation for females sitting on the board relative to male on the same board, and having the similar level of experience and holding similar committee positions. So these three things will then allow us to say something about how the opportunities changed around the reform and whether that was potentially beneficial. Note that I'm not going to say anything about risk taking, etc., because at the end of the day, mapping any firm level outcomes to any individual decision of a director is not accurate, because fundamentally, it's the board that's going to make a decision on, making an investment, deciding on things. So saying that, firm performance improved because females sat on these boards, or more females sat on these boards, is not something that I'll be saying in my talk today or ever. So in terms of the contribution, we know much from that literature, even though the evidence is mixed surrounding the fact that, what happened around introducing gender quotas in Norway. There's, many studies that have kind of come out. There's still people working on it. There are more recent countries like France, Italy, Spain, where, things have kind of evolved in terms of having a different nature of gender quota. So typically there are two ways of how the governments tend to implement gender quotas. One is, there are three ways. One is soft law, the other is hard law, and then there are subdivisions within hard law. So basically in soft law, it's essentially a comply or explain. So Denmark, for example, where my co-author is from, they introduced a comply or explain regulation in 2012, which said, hey, boards, you're required to have a certain fraction of your boards to be, females. But if you don't have it, you can just explain to us why that's the case. So that's the comply or explain, or a soft law. Then you have a hard law where there are two versions of it, where the governments would say, hey, we want to have certain number of female directors on the board. So for example, in India, they said, we want the firms to have at least one female director on the board at all points in time. Or there could be a law like Norway, which said, 40% of your board should be, women. And that's kind of, you can think about that, as a different variation of this law. So basically, these are the three variants that you'll find around the world in terms of how the gender quotas are implemented by governments, right? And then more recently, people have, in the US, including California and many other states, have increasingly been working on this. And again, the evidence from the California law seems to suggest this idea that even in the context of US, there is a limited supply of high quality female directors. And what they find is more of the female directors the same female directors get appointed on more boards, thus making them busy and potentially increasing agency frictions given their limited ability to monitor the boards and the CEO. So here we are going to kind of shed some light on from a perspective of an emerging market and try to understand how these gender quotas themselves operate. Can we learn something that's the same or different, right? If you take a law from the US or other economies and try to implement in this context, you may not get similar outcomes. And that's fundamentally one push for us to try to understand, do we see, is this time different in some sense? So that's kind of the broad motivation. I'll just stop here to see if there are any other questions, before I move on. Yes, Prachi.
So Lakshmi, in the context of politics, you mentioned some work in India, and so there's I believe there's some evidence about kind of the dynamic effect of introducing quotas at the local government level, like panchayat level elections, and so the issue about tokenism kind of gradually, I believe, resolved, at least became less severe as like next generation of women local leaders entered the elections and were. So so my question is, in this paper, do you have the data to kind of explore like, dynamic changes over time? Because again, some of the concerns from one side that you pointed out may get alleviated a little bit over time, such as, supply of female directors, or just appointing ineffective related family members as directors, as kind of the market for female directors matures.
Right. So good questions. I think of it in two ways. One is the fact that, as you point out to the previous work on political reservations, that literature took about 20 years to kind of come to that conclusion, and gender quotas have been around for about 7. So I think if it's an issue about leadership and about pipeline, I mean, not that we have anything to say at this point in time, but it's an important issue that one has to kind of see that how much of this has kind of eliminated some of those things, and I'm sure as more and more research comes out along this dimension, in the long run, that's an important issue that one needs to consider. That is it the case that this gender quota then, say for example, led to more business education or interest in business education among women, right? Do we see that firms hire more women bottom up, or they're hiring more women at different levels of hierarchy? That's an important and interesting question, and that requires more time. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have anything to say in this paper, primarily also because at the organization level, we don't have the breakdown by gender, etc. We would have loved to kind of try that, but we also think that it's going to take a lot more time for it to materialize, just from understanding of the literature, especially from the political reservations literature. The other view is that all of these things can, if anything, compound and double down. So there is this review paper by Rohini Pandey, which basically says that female labor force participation, even though laws have kind of improved, working conditions have kind of improved, female labor force participation in India has actually gone down over the past 2 decades, right? So that would suggest, if anything, we really don't know how these two forces are going to counteract, right? If labor force participation has gone down, at the same time, you have gender quotas that are kind of expanding the pool. If anything, that would mean that, as you change directors on the board, the next time when you impose, because there are also term limits for directors sitting on the boards, right? So the next time when the boards have to be changed, which is going to happen in 2024, watch out for it. You'll really have to then see that what's going to happen, because the women directors can only sit in limited positions, can have only limited terms. That means that probably there's going to be a vacuum, and these issues might resurface again, and tokenism, if anything, might increase. Right, in the long run. So it's an interesting equilibrium question, which we don't have stuff to say about. But again, suppose we find something, it's also going to be very hard for us to say, well, all of this is because of the gender quotas. We can show a lot of trends and try to still understand. But I think that's the fundamental challenge. But it's an interesting question, and I think it's an open question, which is what precisely the Review of Economic Studies paper that I cited by Bertrand et al. It should be somewhere. Yeah, the Bertrand, Black, Leras, Muni, and Jensen paper does in the context of Norway. They look at 15 years out. They look at is business education increasing? Are women? And in their context, they don't find that. So in the long run, in Norway, they don't find that having these gender quotas and having especially those firms in your neighborhood where you see that women are now actively becoming CEOs, etc. They don't see any increase in business education among women. So it's a very poignant kind of result, but it is an important question. And, if people in the audience are interested on working on it, I would highly recommend, given, these things are still evolving. But it's something to kind of look out for. And especially in 2024, when these term limits are going to hit, which was introduced in 2015, it remains to be seen how these boards, and it's a big concern. I mean, if you talk to firms and board members and, all these data providers, they're like, that's the next big thing that's going to turn up, which is, we really don't know how this reshuffling is going to play out, because there aren't enough directors who can sit on these boards, surrounding this regulation, which could then mean that these mandates would potentially squeeze the size of the board and can have implications on, firm value to begin with. So, thank you. Any other questions? No. Okay. So then I'll walk you through. I'll try to keep tables to the minimum. I have a lot of figures to entertain everyone, including myself. So let me start. So this is the standard data set that we've been working on from quite a long time. So this is Prime database. I don't know if IIM Bangalore still has subscription to it. From 2010 to 2020, it covers all the firms listed on the National Stock Exchange. If you want to think about if any of you work in the US context, it's going to be very similar to Board X. And then, of course, you can merge it to Prof, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And that allows you to kind of study decisions for potentially larger firms in the economy relative to the BSE. Just a brief timeline of how things evolved. Effectively, things started in terms of corporate governance back in 1999 with the Birla Committee, and they implemented Clause 49 in 2008. Then they wanted to revamp the company's bill. It went through several attempts, and the 2011 version, which was the first one that talked about gender quotas, was implemented as Companies Act, and then NSE followed up and said, hey, we want the regulation to be more stringent, if not as much as Companies Act. They amended the Clause 49 in April 2014 and required firms to comply with it by October 2014, except for the gender quota, which was effective starting in April 1st, 2015, which means firms had about a year to comply with the gender quota, and we're going to kind of understand what happened in those periods. And then the Kotak Mahindra Committee was appointed in 2017, which recommended, which ultimately SEBI approved, is to have at least one female director as an independent director on boards, starting with the top 500 firms in 2019 and the top 1,000 firms by market cap in 2020. So the first thing we do is, as with the literature on gender quotas, is try to understand what happens to the stock price reaction at the time of the announcement. So the first time, so we look at the passage of the bill, the introduction passage of the bill throughout. So the first mention of gender quota in any form was in the company's bill version on 14th December 2011. And what we find is overall, investors, when they first learn about this, there's a negative stock price reaction. But if you compare, what happens to the stock price reactions on firms that already had a female on the board versus firms that did not have a female director on the board, you find both are equally negative and statistically indistinguishable in terms of their difference. When the law was finally passed on August 2013, you again find similar effects that on average the investor was negative on the fact that governments are mandating boards to have one female director, but we don't find that the boards differentially reacted. And this is one piece, at least the starting point of an evidence, which is different from what we know from other economies, where they find a statistically significant difference between firms that had a female director versus firms that did not have a female director, and those are significantly different. So the first piece of evidence is that in India, yes, on average, the investor in these firms, at least in the National Stock Exchange, feels that these reforms are going to potentially negatively affect firm value, but they don't. They feel this for all firms rather than firms that have a female versus that don't have a female. To begin with, suggesting there might be a limited role to begin with, or limited concern among investors regarding the supply story. So, coming back to the question, the first thing I need to help and define myself is what do we mean by strong patriarchal views, and how we are going to operationalize this in our context. So what we are going to do is we're going to follow the gender economics literature and several papers that have been published, and we're going to take and use the World Value Survey, where they're going to ask this question, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. So this is the question they are asking people in different countries. This is a standardized survey that's been running from, I believe, 1980s. and it's being used by a wide variety of social scientists to begin with. So if in the sample, 52.4% of Indians respond by saying yes. So 52.5% of Indians who responded to this survey, which is nationally representative, is that when jobs are scarce, they would prefer men to have the right on the job relative to a woman. If you compare that to Swedish citizens, they said only 2% of them kind of said that men should have the right over a job than women when it's scarce. Yes, Varun.
Lakshmi, when was this survey administered? In which year?
So this survey that we are using is in 2013, before the law came in. But the survey has, so there are right now, I think there are 9 waves of the survey. But the one that we are using and I'm showing you is before the reform, which is in 2013.
And to whom all was the survey administered? Was it to ordinary people or was it to a specific subset of people?
Ordinary people, that is nationally representative.
Okay, so essentially your assumption will be that on average, a typical board member in a country will have the similar set of patriarchal views as compared to an ordinary male member in that country.
Excellent. And I'm going to show you exactly the point, but what I'm going to show you is how we are going to define and use the fact that there are going to be foreign directors on the board. And I'll try to convince you that some of these measures are really nice for us to use because they're persistent and they're not driven by some of these considerations. And second, there are a lot of robustness tests in the paper where we show that, if you don't take this measure, but if you take other measures of discrimination, for example, which is say, crime against women per capita in an industry, in a region, etc., none of those are able to predict this. And we're going to say, well, this measure is really picking up the patriarchal views, and you're right that we're going to then assign them, but we're going to assign them to the male board members only, and we're going to exploit the fact that they're going to be foreign directors sitting on the board, and we are potentially allowing those foreign views to reflect and not Indian views, right? So the concern would be that if I take and assign the Indian male members Indian views and only use that variation, you might say, well, if anything, Indian board members might be more or less patriarchal in their views, but we're going to use the fact that there are foreign directors sitting and the fact that Indian male directors, actually many of whom get an education outside of India, and we're going to use that variation to begin. And I'll show you it's very stable across the board. And
it's a time invariant measure, right?
Yeah, it's going to be time. Yeah, let me talk a bit more and then we'll see if there are specific questions, but I have 3-4 slides on this just to convince you that it's a very nice measure. And it's something that really helps us in taking forward this measure and applying it in our context. Right. So what we do is, we take this fraction people who respond to this question as yes. And of course, if you're answering yes to this question, are also the other assumption is that you're patriarchal and you have very strong patriarchal views, which I think is a safer assumption. And what we do is we assign it only to the male board members based on 2 ways. One is the fact that your nationality, so the passport that you hold, and we observe that in the data. So it could still be the case, that Indian members who hold foreign passports could still be classified as foreign nationals, and they would potentially have a lower score. If anything, that's going to bias against us finding any effect. And the second is we're going to also allow for the fact that we're going to define this measure also for male Indian directors, but now we are going to, instead of use the nationality, we're going to instead use where they decided to go for their undergraduate, where they decide to go for their master's and the graduate programs, right? So what that's going to tell us is, hey, your exposure to a different environment, which is potentially a lot less patriarchal, could also seep through some of, could be a force which could be countervailing some of these views that you may have. And we're going to use these 2 levels of variation. And what we'll show throughout the paper, irrespective of which measure you use, you always find very similar and consistent results. One, remember the nationality one is going to exploit the fact that there are foreign directors on the board, whereas the second one is going to exploit the fact that Indian directors choose to study in a different country. And we also have it in the paper where we show that these are not picking up skill levels or differences in skills between directors who choose to go out and study relative to directors who who choose to stay in the country to begin with. So of course, the first question is, how persistent are these views on the board, right? So if you look at foreign directors on the board, so the dark bar is just plotting the average of the response rate. So what we do is for each board, we have suppose 5 members, 5 male members, and 2 of them are foreign. We just take assign the 2 average fraction of the country that they belong to. Suppose it's Sweden is 2%, 2%, and then we're going to just divide it for the board and going to take the lagged value. So what we find here is that on average 51.1% is the response rate to that question. And if you look at the white bar, which is telling you the fraction of firms with male foreign directors, it's very constant. It's like 16% to about 20% in the sample. So which means that you don't have firms changing the level of foreign directors, right? Because your concern would be that firms are changing the level of foreign directors, and that is picking up all the variation, and hence we are not picking up changes in views, but we're in fact picking up changes in directors or the composition of directors in the firm to begin with. And here, this is just telling you that's not the case if you look at foreign directors to begin with. If you, on the other hand, plot the education measure, again, you find that it's very flat, right? The fraction of firms that have at least 1 male director that is educated abroad is about 73%, and the maximum is about 79%. So about 80% of the firm in India have at least one male Indian director who's educated abroad, right? So, and this education is defined based on the undergraduate degree. And this again tells you that it's a very nice and stable measure that's persistent kind of over time, and it's not picking up differences in changes or firms responding to the gender quota by changing the composition of male Indian directors who are studying abroad. We have more formal analysis in the paper. I'll leave that out from the presentation. So that was the measure. So Varun, did that help you think about some of the questions that you had about the measure? Okay, any other questions on the measure?
No, nothing else at this point in time.
Okay, fantastic. So the first thing I want to show you is how did the firms respond to this? So here what I'm plotting is, so the dark circles are firms that have at least one male director with strong patriarchal view relative to the board that is completely Indian. And the circle, the white circle is firms that have weak patriarchal views, right? So 1 year before the compliance, the compliance date of 1st April 2015, you clearly see there is a gap, right, between firms that have strong patriarchal views relative to firms that have less patriarchal views. And you see that the difference is about 12.1 percentage points, like 70.3 minus 58.2. As they hit the compliance rate, which is the first red line, you start to see that they start to converge quite significantly, right? So the quota is pushing all firms to comply, right? And effectively around the first compliance date, you find that the gap between strong patriarchal view firm and a weak patriarchal view firm has almost gone down by more than 75% to begin with. But then there still exists a gap. So the SEBI then kind of instituted further penalties, which are not very big, by the way, right? This is just 5,000 rupees or 50,000 rupees plus 1,000 per additional day where you don't have a female director. So these are not very large penalties, yet you start to see that, by the end of, by the middle of the next year, you clearly see that the gap has gone down to about 1.2 percentage points to begin with, right? So there is a clear gap that, the reform was able to kind of push through. So this is the measure based on education. We have similar results when we look at the measure based on foreign directors. Yes, Shashi.
Actually, just to cut to the, so what do you think is going on? So why did they actually start complying given the mild penalties? And I'm sort of aware. I don't hold me to it, but a similar thing on CSR or something like that. Spend 2% of your profits.
Yeah.
Also had modest penalties, but non-compliance is pretty high, right?
Yeah. So the thing was, I'm glad that you brought it up. So the thing with the CSR was it was comply or explain. So there was no need for you to actually spend your 2%. So even if you don't spend your 2%, you can still explain. And there are multiple papers on it, including Prasanna has a paper and Hariom and Shiva Rajgopal, they have paper on this. Basically, the law was comply or explain, so which meant that if you don't comply with it, you just have to explain, and the government would be fine with this. Here, it was a law that was mandating, and the National Stock Exchange mandated that you ought to have one because the Companies Act was defining that every firm should have one woman director on the board. And if you don't comply with it, you had the potential threat of, getting delisted from the stock exchange. You had the potential threat of, the registrar of companies coming behind you, because this was in law that you have to have. And that meant that firms had to have at least one female director. If they don't comply, then they'll run into all sorts of issues in terms of, not just the regulator, but also in terms of compliance with the law itself, with the registrar of companies, because it was codified in the Companies Act itself.
Okay, so at least strong likelihood of fairly severe consequences, right?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
If it's delisting and so on, you're talking about severe consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So despite the small monetary penalty, there are, of course, these severe consequences that are attached to with the non-compliance to begin with. So that's kind of pushed many of these firms. But then you can clearly still see there's a gap between firms that had strong patriarchal views versus others. And that leads us to the question of if you try to measure non-compliance, so here the dependent variable is those firms that did not comply. And we look at it 1 year before, we find that, male controlling directors. So if the firm had all male controlling directors, they were positively related to firms not complying with this law at the beginning. So at the beginning would here in this graph be 2014-15 M1. And you find that, at the same time, fraction of expert directors is uncorrelated, and having foreign directors on the board is also uncorrelated. But what you see clearly is that when you look at patriarchal views, right, both either measured based on nationality or education, they're very strongly correlated, right, which is what the graph was telling you. And then when you kind of come to the compliance date, which is the first red line, which is 1st of April 2015 in the graph, you see that, these relationships, still hold, which is that, even after the compliance date, those firms that did not have, that had all male controlling shareholders, they had positive, they were still non-compliant. If they had fewer expert directors, then they're more likely to be in compliance. And patriarchal views are still kind of positively correlated, but statistically kind of insignificant. So this kind of first evidence that the non-compliance is very strongly, at least at the beginning, explained by these views, and also by an all-male controlling board to controlling shareholder board to begin with. If you then look at how did these firms choose to comply? So now we are only focusing on the subset of firms that were non-compliant in this period. What did they do? What kind of females did they hire? What you find is that, if your board had a lot of expert directors, you did not kind of, there was no relation with whether you decided to have inside female directors, a related female director. So we can observe a familial links and we code that as a related female director, and they choose not to expand the board size. However, if you focus on foreign directors, you find that, boards that had foreign directors, they were less likely to have female inside directors being appointed in these non-compliant firms. They were less likely to be related to the family of the controlling shareholder, and there were no significant differences in terms of how they choose to comply. Right, so you can imagine that firms, non-compliant firms, can choose to comply with this regulation by expanding their board size and also adding a female director, so the net effect is zero. And we don't find that to be the case, except for those instances where strong patriarchal views positively correlate with hiring a related female director and at the same time expanding the board size. Yes, Srini.
Yeah. So I was wondering, in terms of possible correlated omitted variables, like peer effects and board, like business group effects might be relevant, right? So if you're part of a business group, one group member complies, probably it's a uniform policy.
Yeah.
Similarly, peer effects are going to be strong in terms of explaining whether, and when the firms observe the penalties that are being imposed, they're going to learn from that and then comply or not. That's
no, absolutely. So we looked at business group as a predictor, and it doesn't fire off. So business group itself, the indicator itself in the firm doesn't fire off in this sample.
Not business group itself, but whether a group member complied or not is what I'm saying.
Whether a group member complied. No, that's a good suggestion that we can check in the fact that
peer effects, right? So somebody who's in your same peer group,
Yeah.
That's going to have a dynamic effect in terms of compliance before now.
Yeah, no, we can definitely check that to see. Any other suggestions? No. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So, and then we kind of move to the basic part of the paper, which is to say, well, so these are what the non-compliant firms are doing. Let's look at what the compliant firms are doing, right? Because at the end of the day, after 1st April 2015, you do have firms that have complied now, and there's a very minimal fraction that have not complied, which eventually do within the next 6 to 8 months. So what happens to the stock of female directors on the board? So there's just fraction of female directors. I've highlighted the gray area, because that's the year when which firms are allowed to comply. And you do see that there's a significant increase in the fraction of female directors. And as you see that by the end of our sample period, it almost triples, right? So before the reform, it was 5.7%. It goes to about 16.4, right? So this is the stock variable. What happens to appointments? So when we look at, when we split this by independent and inside directors, you find there's a significant increase among independent relative to inside, but you do see that, firms are hiring both female directors as independent and inside directors. If you look at the fraction of appointments that are female, you find that, relative to the pre-reform, by the end of our sample period, every year, the fraction of appointments that are female actually doubles, right? So before the reform, it was about 10.6% of the appointments being female. By the end of our sample period, it's about 22%. You do the same split with independent and inside, you again find that, there's a significant increase, more so in independent director appointments than in inside director appointments to begin with. So what are other firms doing? So when we then look at, firms that are appointing 2 or more females, we find that, by the end of our sample period, about half of the firms on the National Stock Exchange are hiring more than 1 female on the board, right? So the white bar is 2 or more female directors on the board by the end of the year, and dark bars are 3 or more female directors. What this is showing you is that, by the end of our sample period, more firms went above and beyond the ambit of the law and are appointing more than 1 female director on the board. More formally, if you run this in a regression with fixed effects and all sorts of controls, you find that there is an overall increase in appointments. Much of it is coming from these voluntary appointments, which are more than 1 female director appointments, and you see both an increase in independent appointments as independent directors and inside directors, consistent with what I just showed you in the raw data.
Sorry, Lakshmi, one clarification.
Yeah,
are these gross additions or are these net additions?
These are appointments. So these are individual appointments. So we look at whether or not an individual.
For example, okay. If somebody resigns and these appointments could happen in lieu of the person resigning, right?
Yeah. So we check that in a robustness test, and that does not drive it. So what these are these are director appointment year observations. So we're just looking at what happens to just the new appointments that are happening. When we do that at the firm level as net, we still find the effect to go through. And then we take out those firms where, you might have this concern and still the effect goes through. So it's not driven by some of these concerns that you may have, that these are just driven by replacements, or these replacements might themselves be driven by some other firm specific events where we look at director deaths. And we show that, even in those contexts, you do find that, these firms still go above and beyond and keep at least 2 females on the board. So then if you look at, which firms, again, we take the same, take the same characteristics and look at which firms are appointing female directors voluntarily on the board. You find that there's, of course, a post-reform effect. All firms have to do it. So there's a general level effect of the reform that everyone increases. But if you look at, firms that have all male controlling shareholders before the reform, you find that, those are the firms that are less likely to go and above the law and hire more females. So male controlling shareholders are still responding. Foreign directors, on the other hand, their presence on the board is positively related with hiring more females on the board. And when you take the measure of patriarchal views, either based on nationality or on education, you find that's negatively related, which means, the stronger the view in terms of the patriarchal view of the board, of the male board, incumbent board members who decide on the female appointments, the less likely is it that they're going to hire above and beyond the ambit of the law. And this is a statistically significant, economically meaningful and statistically significant effect, because this translates to roughly that, if you change a board, that has all male incumbent directors who have strong patriarchal views to another board that has the weakest patriarchal view. This suggests that you would be able to increase voluntary appointments by 17 percentage points relative to a baseline of 11.6. So this is almost doubling the effect if you just change the composition of the board.
Sorry, one curious question on data availability. So do we have the gender classification of controlling shareholders available in some database?
Gender, so you can match them. So you know the controlling shareholders of the firm. Then you'll have to manually figure out which of them are, of course, male and female. So there's no gender classification, but there's a list of controlling shareholders, which you can then back out to figure out which are the ones that are males and females.
Okay.
So how much time do I have? I know it's already, the time very close to.
Maybe I think you can take 5-10 more minutes.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So then we kind of look at, board networks, which kind of Srini pointed out before in terms of non-compliance. We kind of use that idea to understand, is it the case that if there is a director on sitting on a board which appoints 2 female directors, was that director exposed to female directors on a previous board or on a different board, right? So director connections themselves might play an important role. And this is important in 2 contexts. One is, of course, we know from a large literature, especially in corporate governance, that director networks are important for hiring and firing decisions. And typically directors leverage on their networks to figure out who's a good candidate potentially for a role. The second thing is also the fact that these views might themselves be reflected in the hiring decisions, because these managers themselves or these directors themselves can impose such views in the discussions surrounding who to hire. And that's where we think these 2 potential reasons could drive director networks to hire for firms to hire females above and beyond the ambit of the law. So what we do here is we split the firms based on whether or not their directors who are currently sitting had previously sat on another board that had either 0 or 1 female, which is that they were minimally complying with the law, or they were sitting on a board that kind of exceeded and were having at least 2 or more females, right? And what we clearly see is that the gray bars are telling you that boards on which directors were exposed or had voluntarily appointed females elsewhere were kind of relaying those conversations in these boards and potentially having an effect where on the firms that they were currently sitting were also kind of having an impact by having more females than required by the law. Again, this is suggestive. We're not saying this is causal. We're just saying that seems like the role of board networks is very important in potentially stimulating voluntarily hiring female directors on the board. Of course, one concern you may potentially have that these directors themselves might be different, and we spend quite a bit of time in the paper to show that that's not the case. And the second concern you may have is that because these are director networks, they may be hiring the same set of females across all the boards, and directors might get busy. And we again spend a lot of time in the paper to show that that's not the case, that women are not getting busy. If anything, they're able to find unique female directors who are of high quality, and I'll show you some evidence. I think Dalia has a question.
Yeah, hi Lakshmi. Thank you for this talk. It's really very interesting and an important topic. My question was about this last thing that you raised, and I think Srini raised a similar question. I'm wondering if this can maybe explain your findings. This idea that the nationality is somehow a measure of male patriarchy. To be honest, I felt offended on behalf of Indian men when I saw that measure, and I'm wondering whether there's some other explanation, right? So could it be just that in India, I think there is the sense that you have the top 500 companies which are very professionalized, hired from the best institutes, and then you have the smaller companies which are family businesses run in a less it's not a very professionalized environment. So I wonder whether that's all you're observing. It's not about nationality somehow reflecting male patriarchy, the number of foreign directors you have. Instead, could it just be that these top 500 firms which are professionalized. They sit on boards, sit on other boards. The directors sit on other boards where there are other women on those boards. They also have foreign directors on their boards. They have directors on their boards who have a foreign education. They just have more access. They comply more. These are more professionalized firms. And then you have the rest, which are smaller firms, less professionalized. They don't have foreign directors on their boards. They don't have women directors on their boards. Their board members don't sit on other boards that have women directors. And that's why you observe this effect, not because there is any sort of causal relationship between having foreign directors and hiring additional women directors. So it's not patriarchy that you're observing. You're just observing professionalized versus non-professionalized.
Thank you. So let me start off with the last sentence. Nowhere are we claiming this is causal. So let me be very clear. We are not saying this is causal. What we're trying to pinpoint is precisely the stories that you're coming up with, is that, it's precisely though, if you look at, I'm just going back to my previous slide, it's precisely those firms that have, all male controlling shareholders. First of all, this has got nothing to do with size, by the way. We have a lot of robustness in the paper to show that this is not a big firm phenomenon, not a small firm phenomenon. There is no market segmentation for women where, they only sit in large boards or small boards. We find that they sit across all the boards, and there is a uniform expansion of a labor of female directors. So it used to be 350 unique directors. It went up to 1,000 unique female directors sitting on different boards, not just large boards or small boards, and they're not getting busy. So it's none of those effects. Second, to your point that, we are showing you different elements that, it is the case that, when you look at firms that have the characteristics that positively also correlate with some of the idea of patriarchy, for example, having all male controlling shareholders, having, having fewer expert directors, or having an all male Indian boards, those characteristics very strongly correlate with these patriarchal views. And those characteristics also explain the fact that why they don't go above and beyond and try to capitalize on this opportunity where, half of the firms in the economy, and at least the National Stock Exchange, were able to utilize this opportunity and able to hire good quality female directors on their boards, right? So that begs to the question, why is it the other half not doing it? And part of the reason seems to be coming from the fact that all these factors that are correlated with male patriarchal views, or you may want to call a different agency friction, you may want to broadly label it as an agency friction, seems to be driving some of these effects. And remember, we are all looking within the same firm. So these are all these are all estimations with firm fixed effects. So that already is taking into account any issues you have about professionalization. We are looking at the same firm over time, and we are using the fact that everything else is remaining constant in these firms, but by virtue of having this board structure that they've chosen, which potentially could be suboptimal, you are observing that they are not having more females on the board. Is it good? Is it bad? That's up for debate. I mean, there's nothing that I would be able to say, but at least it seems like half of the firms which are doing these things, they are able to capitalize on the market. They're able to capitalize and get better females who potentially can add value, right? So that is what it is. So
that makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. And consistent with what you also mentioned, right? It's also consistent that they are connected through board networks. But remember, all of this is coming from within firm estimation. So these are already taking into account all the concerns that you have, whether you're cross comparing different set of firms. That's not the case. It is the fact that you have these boards, and we spend quite a lot of time in the paper discussing some of these issues because these are important, right? As you rightly point out, we don't want to make a blanket statement, but at the same time, we're also careful in saying, well, it's not causal, right? We're not saying that these views are causing firms to a point, but it seems like the characteristics that are correlated with some of these aspects seem to be very important. Okay, so I'll just quickly take 1 minute, and then I know I'm already running out of my extra 10 minutes, and I don't want to keep everyone waiting. Is that there could be so we then basically try to analyze what happens to changes in labor market opportunities. Right? I've been spending quite a bit of time saying, you see more females being appointed, more than what the law requires. There are more unique females now in the labor market. That also means that potentially this has a scope for improving and providing them with opportunity to sit on important committees. So when we look at audit committee and remuneration committee, what happens to the fraction of these committees where women serve as members? Of course, that goes up threefold from, being 4.5% before the reform to about 12.8%. However, at the same time, when you look at how many of them are serving as, or what fraction are serving as chair, you also then find there's a significant increase, however, at a smaller pace and scale. The same thing happens for nomination and remuneration committee. And however, when we look at CEO and MD of the firm, we don't find that this is translating to the upper echelons of the C-suite yet. And this goes back to Prachi's question that, might be all of these things might take a little bit more time where, these new women who are entering the labor market might have to gain some experience and potentially, could create a pathway to the executive suite to begin with. If you look at quality as measured by stock price reaction, you find that, before the reform, on average, female directors, investors responded positively. However, at the time of the implementation, investors responded negatively. And that's because you had a lot more newer female who are inexperienced who are joining the board. And that partly explains this negative stock price reactions. However, if you compare the stock price reactions ex post, it's almost a precisely estimated 0, and it's not significantly different between male and female directors. If you look at experience, you find that female directors who are experienced and who are appointed on the boards, investors tend to perceive them as more positive. And most of the firms which are not compliant, which are appointing just the minimum number of female directors, are doing so by expanding their board size, and investors interpret this as value reducing to begin with. If you look at other measures of how much experience they have, what specialization they have, they're significantly better. And lastly, I'll just leave with these two figures, is that if you look at the compensation gap for a woman sitting on the same board as a man, holding constant all the positions that they have, all the appointments, tenure, expertise, etc. Before the reform, you clearly find there is a 30% gap between the compensation for male and female on the same board, holding everything else constant, which goes to 0 after the reform. Right. So this is one of the strong pieces of evidence that having more females participate in the economy, who are well qualified, also potentially has this benefit of having a reduction in compensation gap between males and females. And this is not driven by quality differences, because when we examine directors who were there before and after the reform, you find similarly significant reductions in the gender gap, suggesting that females who were sitting on the boards from before also benefited from having an expanded labor pool. I won't bore you with a lot of robustness tests that we done in the paper, given the importance of the question and something. So I'll just leave it at the conclusion slide. I know I've already run over time. More than happy to stay and discuss any questions you may have. But otherwise, thank you so much. I think all the questions and comments were very useful.
Thanks so much, Lakshmi. Really enjoyed the paper.
Thank you,
and thanks Srini as always for inviting us. Okay, I'm going to leave. Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Lakshmi. It was a very nice presentation. Hope we can meet you sometime on campus whenever you are in Bangalore and have your presentation then in person.
No, but we'd definitely love to be back. And thank you so much, Varun. Thank you so much, Srini, Shashi. It's good to see everyone. It's been a long time, but I'll definitely try to drop in whenever I'm in Bangalore next time.
Thanks. Thank you very much.